iron or train cuts through red pulbara dust, carrying the modern power of BHP across the country that first made its name. Yet that name once meant more than resource scale. BHP was the big Australian, born from Broken Hill, tied to steelworks, workers, towns, and the belief that Australia could turn its own minerals into industrial strength. The company did not vanish. It became a global resources power. The harder story is what changed around it. Old institutional wealth built from ore, steel, capital, and public trust shifted shape, while places like Newcastle felt the cost. To understand BHP, we have to follow the name from Broken Hill to global power, and ask what Australia kept, what quietly changed, and who carried the weight. The red dust machine that still moves. The train does not look like memory at first. It looks like work still being done. Long, heavy, and almost endless, it moves through red country with the weight of modern resource power behind it. Each wagon carries part of the BHP story as it exists now. Material taken from Australian ground, moved by rail, pushed toward ports, and sent into a world still built on steel, energy, machinery, construction, and infrastructure. That is the first point this story has to make clearly. BHP did not vanish. It did not become only a faded sign, an empty factory wall, or a name kept alive by former workers and local museums. It remains a major resources company, tied to commodities that still shape the physical world: iron ore, copper, metallurgical coal, and other materials linked to future demand. From a distance, that could sound like a simple success story. A company born in Australia grew large enough to compete globally. A mining name became a resources giant. The trains kept moving. The ships kept loading. The name survived. That survival makes the story more complicated. For many Australians, BHP once carried a wider meaning. It was tied to Broken Hill, steelworks, ports, furnaces, workshops, and towns where people understood the company through work rather than corporate reports. It sat inside the belief that Australia could do more than dig minerals from the ground. It could mine, make, build, ship, and turn raw wealth into industrial strength. That was the older BHP, the big Australian. The phrase mattered because it suggested belonging as well as size. BHP sounded like part of the country's machinery, a company connected to mines, steel towns, pay packets, apprenticeships, contracts, family histories, and industrial pride. Its power was not old money in the polished sense of family estates or inherited titles. BHP represented a harder Australian form of long-term power: ore, steel, capital, infrastructure, public trust, and control over resources that shaped entire regions. That kind of power does not need a mansion to be visible. It can be seen in a railway line across harsh country. It can be heard in a steelworks before the shift begins. It can sit behind a town's confidence, a worker's mortgage, a supplier's order book, or a family's belief that one employer will still be there when the next generation leaves school. That is why the modern image of BHP carries attention. The company is still strong. In some ways, it became stronger by focusing more sharply on global resources and moving away from parts of its older industrial identity. Yet the BHP that still moves through red country is not the same simple image many Australians once attached to the name. The older version felt broader. It was more industrial, more visible, more closely tied to steel, towns, and the daily work of making things. The modern version is larger, more global, more disciplined, and more distant from the factory gate meaning that once gave the name much of its emotional weight. A resource train can show scale. It can show capital, machinery, distance, and power. It cannot show what changed for people who knew BHP through a shift roster, a steel furnace, a union notice board, a local shop, or a family member coming home from the works. That part of the story waits in places like Newcastle. It waits in the memory of steelmaking, where BHP was not an abstract institution. It was a daily presence. It shaped work, wages, routines, skills, local businesses, and the confidence of a city that had learned to see itself through industry. The company survived. The name stayed powerful. The resources kept moving. Survival did not mean everything connected to the old BHP survived in the same form. Some places had to adjust to a future no longer built around the same industrial promise. Some workers and contractors felt the cost of decisions made far from the shop floor. Some memories moved from active work sites into archives, memorials, and stories passed through families. So the story does not begin with ruins. It begins with movement. A train still runs. Or still travels. The name still carries weight. The modern machine has not stopped. The question is what kind of power that machine represents now, and what had to change for BHP to become that kind of company. To answer that, the red dust is only the last image in a much older chain. Before the Global Resources Group, before the steelworks, before the nickname, before the ports and boardrooms, there was a remote mineral claim in western New South Wales, and a discovery that turned Broken Hill from a place on the map into the beginning of Australian industrial power. The Broken Hill claim that became a company. Before BHP became a train across the Pilbara, before it became steelworks, shipping, boardrooms, and global resource power, it began in a much quieter Australian landscape. Broken Hill was not yet the symbol it would later become. It sat in the far west of New South Wales, in hard country shaped by distance, heat, dust, and mineral promise. To people passing through, the line of hills may not have looked like the beginning of a national institution. To a boundary rider named Charles Rasp, the ground suggested something more. In 1883, Rasp staked a claim in the Broken Hill area. That claim did not instantly create a corporate giant. It was still a risk, a possibility, a piece of country that needed proof. Mining fortunes often begin that way, not with certainty, only with a belief that something valuable lies beneath the surface, waiting for capital, labour, and patience to make it real. The stronger proof came in January 1885, when Philip Charlie found the first significant silver deposit on the Broken Hill property. That discovery changed the weight of the claim. It gave the ground a different meaning. What had been uncertain became organised around value. The hills were no longer just a feature of a remote station landscape. They became the beginning of a company. Around that early discovery stood a small group remembered as the Syndicate of Seven. Their role matters because BHP was not born as a family dynasty, and not as a company handed down through inherited privilege. It began through prospecting, claim holding, organisation, and the ability to turn mineral rights into corporate structure. The early power did not sit inside one family name. It sat inside control of the ground itself. That is the first old money lesson in the BHP story. In Australia, old power often came from land, resources, access, and the ability to organise capital around something the country needed. For pastoral families, it might be wool or cattle country. For banks, it might be credit and trust. For BHP, it began with ore. A claim in western New South Wales became a source of institutional power because the mineral body beneath it could be owned, financed, worked, transported, and sold. By 1885, the Broken Hill Proprietary Company Limited had been floated. That moment marks the shift from discovery to institution. A mineral claim became a public company. A remote Australian place became part of the machinery of investment, law, labour, and industrial ambition. The name itself carried the origin, Broken Hill Proprietary. The company was tied to the place from the beginning. Stories like this are often told as if greatness was obvious from the first moment. It was not. Early mining ventures were fragile. Claims could disappoint. Capital could dry up. Transport could become impossible. Labour had to be found, housed, organised, and paid. Machinery had to be brought in, or had to be extracted from hard ground and turned into something the market would reward. Nothing about Broken Hill's remoteness made that easy. That difficulty is part of why the origin matters. BHP's later scale can make the beginning feel inevitable, as if a global resources group was always waiting inside the claim. The real story is more human and more Australian than that. It involved people reading a landscape, investors accepting risk, workers entering hard country, and a company forming around the possibility that the earth beneath Broken Hill could support something larger than a local mine. The first people who worked that ground were not dealing in national myth. They were dealing in dust, tools, heat, uncertainty, and the physical reality of mining. The wealth that later fed boardrooms and balance sheets began with labour in a difficult place. That connection should not disappear from the story. BHP's institutional power started with minerals, yet minerals only became power because people organised around them and worked them. Broken Hill then became more than an origin point. It became a symbol of how Australian resource wealth could move from country to company, from claim to capital, from local discovery to national consequence. It gave BHP a foundation that was physical, specific, and deeply Australian. The company's later history would grow far beyond that first place. Its identity would stretch into steel, shipping, collieries, ports, rail lines, and global markets. Its name would eventually carry a weight that no single mining claim could explain on its own. Still, The structure of its power was already visible in that early transformation. First came the ground. Then came the claim. Then came the company. Once Broken Hill had been turned into corporate power, the next question was no longer whether there was value beneath the earth. It was how far that value could travel once it was connected to capital, labor, machinery, transport, and the wider ambitions of an industrial nation. How or became institutional power. A mineral claim is only the beginning. To become power, it has to be worked, financed, defended, expanded, and connected to a market beyond the ground where it was found. That was the step that changed BHP from a Broken Hill discovery into something more lasting. The ore beneath Western New South Wales was valuable, yet value underground does not move by itself. It needs labour. It needs machinery. It needs transport. It needs investors willing to wait for return. It needs managers, engineers, surveyors, smelters, clerks, and workers prepared to turn harsh country into an operating industrial system. That was where the company began to take shape as more than a claim. At Broken Hill, BHP's early wealth came from mining silver, lead, and zinc. Those minerals gave the company its first business engine. The or body was the asset. The company structure was the tool that allowed that asset to be controlled, financed, and worked at scale. Once the Broken Hill Proprietary Company Limited had been floated, the story was no longer only about discovery. It became a story about ownership, capital, and the ability to organize a difficult operation in a remote Australian place. That distinction matters. Many discoveries create excitement. Far fewer become institutions. BHP became powerful because it could turn mineral rights into a system, raise money, employ people, build processes, move materials, manage risk, and expand beyond the first opportunity. The real fortune was not only what sat beneath the hills. It was the company's ability to convert that ore into a durable structure of business power. Here BHP's old money character becomes clearer. There was no single-family dynasty sitting at the center for generations, no pastoral mansion carrying the family name, no private fortune passed quietly from heir to heir. BHP's power was institutional. It was built through the company itself, resource control, public company capital, industrial discipline, and the growing belief that this business could sit near the centre of Australia's future. In an Australian context, that kind of power can be as deep as family wealth. It does not rely on a portrait above a staircase. It sits in leases, balance sheets, rail connections, machinery, company offices, labour forces, and the confidence of investors. It sits in the ability to take something from the earth and build a structure around it that outlives the people who first saw the opportunity. Broken Hill gave BHP the resource. Corporate organisation gave it reach. The early company had to solve problems that were physical before they were financial, or had to be extracted from hard ground. Workers had to live and work in a remote place. Equipment had to be moved across distance. Materials had to be processed and transported. The business had to survive the gap between promise and profit. Each practical challenge forced the company to become more organised, more disciplined, and more connected to the wider Australian economy. That is how a mine begins to become an institution. As BHP grew, its ambitions moved beyond the first mineral body. The company expanded into steelworks, shipping, and collieries, and that expansion changed the meaning of its power. Mining had made BHP wealthy. Industry made it harder to ignore. Once a company controls resources, then connects those resources to production, transport, and heavy industry, it stops looking like a single business and starts looking like part of the country's industrial framework. Steelworks meant furnaces, mills, machinery, skilled labour, and long-term investment. Shipping meant movement beyond the mine. Collieries meant fuel and energy for industrial production. Each step pulled BHP further away from the image of a remote mining venture and closer to the role it would later occupy in Australian life. A company whose reach touched work, infrastructure, towns, exports, and national confidence. For ordinary people, this power was not abstract. It appeared as jobs, apprenticeships, contracts, rail lines, industrial sites, and local economies that became tied to the company's decisions. A miner did not need to understand corporate strategy to know that the mine mattered. A supplier did not need to sit in a boardroom to feel the importance of a large industrial customer. A town did not need to read an annual report to understand what a major employer meant for wages, shops, schools, homes, and future expectations. BHP's power grew because it connected the ground to people's lives. That connection also made the company's influence heavier. A business built around resources can seem distant when described through markets and production. Seen from the towns and worksites, it becomes far more human. Every expansion required people to do the work. Every new industrial site created dependence as well as opportunity. Every decision made higher up the company could eventually reach workers, families, suppliers, and communities far from the rooms where strategy was discussed. The company's rise carried two truths from the beginning. It helped build Australian industrial capacity. It also created a form of power that ordinary places could come to rely on. That is what made BHP different from a smaller mining operation. Its strength did not stay confined to the ore body. It spread into systems. Capital became plant and equipment. Ore became output. Output became contracts. Contracts became employment. Employment became community confidence. Over time, that chain gave the company a kind of authority broader than profit alone. By the time BHP moved deeper into heavy industry, the foundation for its later national image was already in place. The old money structure was there: control the resource, organize the capital, build the industry, shape the places that depend on it, and let the name gather weight across generations. Yet institutional power needs a public face before it becomes national memory. For BHP, that face would not come from the claim alone. It would come from steel, from the places where Australian minerals were turned into the visible, heavy, working material of a country trying to build itself. When steel made BHP feel national, or made BHP valuable. Steel made it visible. A mine could sit far from the coast, far from the capital cities, far from the daily life of most Australians. Its wealth could be measured in output, leases, dividends, and company reports. Steel entered the world people could see. It appeared in factories, bridges, ships, railways, buildings, machinery, tools, and the working shape of a modern country. For BHP, that mattered. The company's early power had come from Broken Hill and the mineral wealth beneath the ground. Mining alone did not fully explain why the name would later carry such national weight. The deeper shift came when BHP moved from extracting resources into making the heavy material of industry. Steel gave the company a public face. It turned mineral power into something more immediate, more physical, and more closely tied to Australian working life. Newcastle became one of the strongest symbols of that shift. The steelworks there placed BHP inside a city, not only inside a mine. It connected the company to furnaces, rolling mills, railway lines, workshops, ports, engineering skill, and thousands of working routines. It gave the name a rhythm people could understand without reading a balance sheet. Gates opening. Shifts changing. Tools carried in. Pay packets taken home. Local businesses depending on wages. Families building their lives around the assumption that heavy industry would remain part of the city's future. That is how a company becomes national in feeling. Not only by being large, by being present. BHP's steel identity made the company feel practical and productive. It suggested that Australia could take what lay beneath its own ground and turn it into the materials of national development. The country was not simply exporting raw promise. Through steel, BHP stood for the idea that Australian resources could feed Australian industry, and Australian workers could help turn those resources into something solid enough to build with. That image carried pride. It also carried dependence. For the workers inside steelworks, the company's power was not an abstract national achievement. It was hot, loud, physical, and demanding. It lived in night shifts, skilled trades, industrial hazards, apprenticeships, union notices, maintenance work, and the discipline of keeping large machinery moving. The pride attached to steel did not erase the difficulty of the work. It made the work visible as part of something larger. Industrial memory can become too clean from a distance. A steelworks can look heroic in an archive photograph. Smoke rising behind a skyline. Workers standing beside machinery. A city built around production. Inside that image were people doing hard work under pressure, families tied to one employer, suppliers depending on contracts, and communities whose confidence was linked to decisions they did not control. BHP's national feeling was built on that connection between corporate power and ordinary labour. The company gained reputation from what workers helped make. It gained trust from the scale of its operations. It gained authority from being attached to the physical building of Australian industry. That was institutional old money in motion. Long-term influence created through resources, factories, capital, infrastructure, and the public belief that the company mattered to the country. Steel strengthened that belief. It gave BHP a story that could be told through places. Broken Hill showed where the mineral wealth began. Newcastle showed what that wealth could become when it entered the machinery of industry. Ports and transport links showed how the system moved. Workshops and mills showed how skill turned material into output. Towns showed how a company's presence could shape more than production. It could shape expectations. When a company reaches that point, its name begins to mean more than its business model. For some Australians, BHP was not encountered through a product on a shelf. It was encountered through family employment, industrial headlines, regional identity, share market news, steel towns, mining stories, and the sense that the company sat somewhere near the centre of the national economy. Its power was felt through work and reputation rather than everyday consumer habit. That made the later transformation more emotionally complicated. If BHP had only been a remote mining firm, changes in strategy might have felt distant. If it had only been a financial name, restructuring might have belonged mostly to investors. Steel made the story heavier because steel tied BHP to workers and places. It made the company's decisions feel local, even when those decisions were part of a far larger corporate and market logic. The steelworks gave BHP a human scale inside its industrial scale. A furnace cannot run on reputation. A mill cannot move without labour. A port cannot function without people managing the flow of materials. A town cannot build confidence around a company unless that company becomes part of the pattern of daily life. That is what happened in places where BHP's presence was deep enough to shape not only employment, but identity. The name became connected to a kind of Australian confidence. Minerals from Australian ground, processed through Australian industry, carried by Australian workers, and linked to the building of a modern nation. It was an image powerful enough to outlive many of the conditions that created it. That is the point where memory begins to harden around a company. BHP's steel story helped make the name feel stable, almost permanent. It suggested weight, usefulness, and national purpose. It made the company sound less like a private corporation and more like part of the country's industrial furniture. The stronger that image became, the more difficult it would be to question what sat underneath it. No steelworks, no matter how important, exists outside pressure. Markets change. Costs rise. Technology shifts. Competition intensifies. Capital moves toward the places it sees the strongest return. A company that looks permanent from the factory gate can be facing very different calculations inside the boardroom. For now, the public image still held. BHP had moved from or to industry, from Broken Hill to steel, from a mining company into a name that felt national. The confidence was real. The work was real. The pride was real. So were the pressures beginning to gather behind it. The name Australia thought it understood. A company can become familiar without ever feeling close. Most Australians did not meet BHP through a product on a kitchen table or a shopfront on a main street. They met it through scale. Through headlines. Through mines, steelworks, ports, industrial towns, share market pages, family employment, and the repeated sense that somewhere in the background of national life, BHP was always there. That is what made the name different. BHP was not a household brand in the way a supermarket, bank, biscuit tin, or department store might be. Its presence was heavier and less ordinary. It belonged to the country's industrial imagination. It suggested iron, ore, furnaces, rails, ships, machinery, investment, exports, and work that most people never saw directly, yet understood as part of the national economy. That is why the phrase "the big Australian" carried weight. It gave the company a public shape. 3 words turned a complex mining and industrial corporation into something easier to recognize. The name sounded national. Solid. Useful. Almost permanent. It suggested a company whose size had become part of Australia's own sense of industrial confidence. The phrase did not make BHP powerful. The power had already been built through minerals, capital, steel, shipping, collieries, infrastructure, and the labour of people who worked the sites. The phrase mattered because it captured how that power was seen. It gave the public image a kind of shorthand. BHP was big because it controlled resources. It felt Australian because those resources were tied to places people could name. Broken Hill gave it origin. Newcastle gave it steel memory. The Pilbara would later give it a modern resource image. Around those places sat workers, contractors, engineers, apprentices, suppliers, families, and towns that gave the name a human weight no company slogan could create on its own. That was the public image Australia thought it understood. A company born from the ground. A company that helped turn minerals into industry. A company whose scale seemed to confirm a national promise, that Australia's raw materials could become more than exports, more than numbers, more than distant wealth. They could become work, skill, production, and confidence. Inside that image was a particular kind of Australian old power. Not a family dynasty. Not a private estate. Not a name preserved through inheritance alone. BHP's influence came from the authority of an institution that had grown too important to ignore. Its power sat in leases, steelworks, rail connections, capital markets, board decisions, industrial skill, port access, export flows, and public trust. It was a form of old money built less around bloodline than continuity, the continuity of a company whose reach stretched across generations and regions. That made BHP respectable in a practical way. It seemed productive. It seemed useful. It seemed connected to national development. Unlike fortunes built quietly behind gates, BHP's power was visible in the physical world. It appeared in materials, work sites, infrastructure, and employment. People could argue about corporate decisions, market pressure, or strategy, yet the company's place in Australian industrial history was difficult to deny. Respectability can hide strain. When a name becomes that familiar, the public image can start to feel stronger than the business reality underneath it. The words "the big Australian" made BHP sound stable, almost immovable. Yet no company built on mining and heavy industry is protected from pressure simply because the public recognizes its name. Commodity markets do not care about sentiment. Steel economics do not pause for nostalgia. Capital does not stay in one form forever because a city, a workforce, or a country remembers what a company used to represent. Those harder forces were already part of BHP's world, even while the national image remained strong. The company's old identity depended on industries that required constant investment, long planning, difficult labor, and exposure to global prices. Mining could create enormous wealth, then face the next cycle. Steel could symbolize national strength, then become vulnerable to costs, competition, and strategy. A company could be respected and still have to choose where its future return would come from. That is where the public image began to carry a quiet tension. For workers and towns, BHP could feel like permanence. For executives and investors, it was also a portfolio of assets, markets, risks, and future decisions. Those two views could exist side by side for a long time. A steelworker could see the company through the gate. A family could see it through wages. A supplier could see it through contracts. A board could see it through exposure, margins, capital allocation, and global opportunity. None of those views alone tells the whole story. Together, they explain why BHP's transformation would become so emotionally complicated. The company's reputation had been built through physical industry and national usefulness. Any move away from that older image would not feel like a simple change in corporate structure. It would feel, in certain places, like the ground shifting under a familiar name. The stronger the phrase became, the more difficult it was to see the questions forming behind it. How much of the big Australian belonged to steel? How much belonged to mining? How much belonged to workers and towns? How much belonged to capital and strategy? And what would happen when those parts no longer pointed in the same direction? For a time, the image still held. The name still sounded solid. The history still carried confidence. Yet the forces that would test that confidence were already gathering inside the industries that had made BHP feel national in the first place. The pressure beneath the big Australian. A name can sound permanent long after the structure beneath it has begun to strain. For BHP, the public image was heavy with confidence. Broken Hill gave the company its origin. Steel gave it national feeling. The phrase "the big Australian" gave people a way to understand its place in the country's industrial life. From the outside, that kind of company can look immovable, as if size itself protects it from pressure. Size does not protect a company from markets. BHP's older industrial identity depended on businesses that were difficult, expensive, and exposed to forces far beyond any one town or work site. Mining could create immense wealth, then turn sharply with commodity cycles. Steel could represent national strength, then face rising costs, changing demand, imported competition, and the constant need for investment. Heavy industry could look solid from the street while becoming harder to justify inside a company deciding where its future returns would come from. That was the pressure beneath the image. The public saw BHP through national memory: mines, steelworks, workers, exports, and Australian industry. The business also had to look at margins, capital, global demand, aging assets, competitive pressure, and where large amounts of money should be committed next. Those two realities did not always move together. A steelworks could mean one thing to a city and another thing to a corporate strategy. To workers, it could mean a stable wage, a trade, a routine, a place where skill mattered. To families, it could mean a mortgage, school fees, groceries, and a future planned around regular employment. To local suppliers, it could mean orders, contracts, and the daily movement of money through a regional economy. To a company operating across resources and heavy industry, the same works could become a question of cost, competition, and long-term direction. That difference did not make the workers wrong. It made them exposed. The people who carried the work were not the ones setting global commodity prices, deciding capital priorities, or weighing the future of steel inside a changing corporate portfolio. They were the people closest to the heat, the noise, the machinery, and the gates. They helped create the reputation that made the name feel national. When the business model came under pressure, they were also among the first to learn that a familiar name could no longer promise the same future. Newcastle made that tension especially visible. Before the final closure decision arrived, employment at the Newcastle Steelworks had already been falling over a long period. That fact matters because it shows the pressure was not sudden. The works did not move from security to crisis overnight. The decline in employment pointed to something deeper. The old industrial model was already narrowing while the public image of BHP still carried the weight of national confidence. For a city built around steel, that kind of narrowing is not just a statistic. It changes the feeling of a place. A smaller workforce means fewer people passing through the gates. Fewer households directly tied to the works. Fewer young people seeing the same path their parents or neighbours had followed. Less certainty for suppliers, contractors, clubs, shops, and families whose lives had formed around the assumption that heavy industry would remain a permanent anchor. The pressure was economic, yet its first language was local. Inside BHP, steel had to compete with other possible futures. Mining and resources offered scale that could stretch far beyond one city or one national industrial story. Global markets were changing the way large companies thought about focus, return, and risk. A company built from Australian mineral wealth could still be Australian in origin, still powerful in name, and still deeply tied to the country's economy, while gradually becoming less centered on the older promise of turning minerals into steel inside a broad domestic industrial system. That shift is easy to oversimplify. It was not simply a story of a company turning its back on a city. It was not simply a story of foreign competition. It was not simply a story of one decision made in one room. The record points to a chain of forces: steel economics, global competition, resource cycles, capital demands, changing strategy, and a company increasingly drawn toward the scale of global resources. Those forces did not remove responsibility from corporate decision makers. They help explain the environment in which decisions were made. A serious telling has to hold both ideas together. The pressure was real, and the consequences still landed on workers and communities. That is what made BHP's transformation difficult to reduce to a single moral sentence. The company's institutional power had been built by connecting ore, capital, industry, labor, and public trust. The same structure that made BHP strong also made its changes heavier. When a smaller company shifts direction, the consequences may stay inside one balance sheet. When a company like BHP shifts direction, the consequences can move through towns, trades, suppliers, families, and national memory. The old image of the big Australian made those consequences sharper. A familiar national name carries expectations. People do not expect it to behave like a sentimental institution, yet they often attach stability to it. They expect continuity because the name has been there for so long. They expect weight because it has shaped so much. They expect the future to look at least partly like the past. Markets rarely honor those expectations. By the time the pressure became impossible to ignore, BHP's steel identity was already being tested by forces larger than any one work site. The company could still look strong. The name could still sound solid. The resource wealth could still be immense. Beneath that confidence, the question was changing. Not whether BHP mattered. It clearly did. The harder question was which parts of BHP would matter most in the future, and which people and places would be left to carry the cost when the answer began to change. Newcastle learns what transformation costs. Pressure becomes real when it reaches a gate. For years, the old BHP image had been built from things Australians could see and trust: mines, steel, work, wages, production, and the confidence of heavy industry. In Newcastle, that image was not distant. It was part of the city's working rhythm. The steelworks was not an idea in a corporate report. It was a place people entered, heard, smelled, depended on, and built their lives around. Then the pressure that had been gathering inside steel became a public decision. In 1997, BHP announced that steelmaking at Newcastle would close. The final closure came in 1999. Those two dates turned a long industrial strain into something workers, contractors, families, suppliers, and local businesses had to face directly. The old question about BHP's future was no longer abstract. It had moved from markets and strategy into a city that had carried the company's steel identity for generations. Newcastle had known BHP through work, through the movement of men and women at shift change, through trades learned over years, through pay packets that supported homes, through local businesses that depended on industrial wages, through families that understood the steelworks not as scenery, but as a source of routine, pride, risk, and expectation. A major industrial employer does not sit in a city lightly. It shapes the pattern of streets, the timing of shops, the confidence of apprentices, the habits of families, and the way a place talks about itself. For Newcastle, steel was not only production. It was identity. It helped explain the city to itself. That is why the closure carried more than one kind of cost. There was the direct cost of jobs. Sources describe thousands of workers and contractors affected by the end of BHP steelmaking at Newcastle. One case study put the impact at 2,835 jobs and about 1,100 on-site contractors. Other accounts describe the loss in the same broad human scale. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of people connected to a works that had helped define the city's industrial life. Numbers matter here because they stop the story from becoming vague. They remind us that transformation is not only a word companies use when they want to sound forward-looking. Transformation has a weight. It lands in households, in local shops, in trade skills, in the plans people had made around work they thought might last. Still, numbers cannot carry the whole meaning. A worker with decades of service is not just a unit in a labor force count. A contractor is not just a line in a shutdown estimate. An apprentice watching a path narrow is not simply part of an industry adjustment. A family that built its future around one employer feels changed differently from an investor reading about strategy. The steelworks had given people a place inside BHP's national story. When that place closed, the company's transformation became personal in a way no merger document could capture. Archived material from the closure period shows the human atmosphere around Newcastle's final steel days. Workers facing the end of an industrial era, people preparing to leave a works that had shaped their routines, and a city trying to understand what came after a name that had seemed built into its foundations. Those images have power because they do not need exaggeration. The gates, the helmets, the workers, the machinery, the finality of a place changing purpose, the facts already carry the emotion. A serious telling has to be careful here. The closure should not be turned into a simple morality play. BHP was operating inside real pressures: steel economics, competition, capital demands, and a corporate future increasingly drawn toward global resources. Those forces do not erase responsibility from the people who made decisions. They also prevent the story from being reduced to one villain, one room, or one moment. The workers did not create those pressures. They carried them. That distinction is central to the whole documentary. The people closest to the furnaces, mills, maintenance sheds, and workshops were not the ones deciding global strategy. They were the people who had made the old BHP image believable. Their labor helped give the company its national reputation. Their city helped make the steel identity real. When the old model narrowed, they were among those most exposed to the consequences. In Newcastle, the meaning of the big Australian became harder to hold without qualification. The phrase had suggested national strength, productivity, and belonging. The closure revealed another side of institutional power. The same scale that makes a company feel stable can make its decisions enormous when direction changes. A company with deep roots in a community can still make choices according to markets, capital priorities, and future strategy. The name can remain strong while the place that gave part of that name its emotional meaning is forced to adjust. That is the painful complexity of BHP. The company was not disappearing. It was preparing for a different kind of future. Its resource strength remained immense. Its global ambitions were expanding. The old industrial footprint, especially the steel side of the story, no longer sat in the same position. For Newcastle, that distinction did not soften the immediate impact. A job lost is not made easier because the company survives elsewhere. A works closing is not made less real because the business continues in another form. A city can recover, adapt, and reshape itself, while still carrying the memory of what was removed from its daily life. The emotional cost was not only grief for a workplace. It was the uncertainty of what replaces an industrial anchor after it is gone. What happens to a city that has known itself through steel? What happens to workers whose skills were formed around machinery, heat, process, and discipline? What happens to families whose sense of security came from a company that seemed too large, too important, too embedded to withdraw from the work that gave the place its identity? Those questions made Newcastle the human center of BHP's transformation. Not because Newcastle explains the whole company. It does not. BHP's story stretches from Broken Hill to the Pilbara, from mining to steel, from national industry to global resources. Newcastle matters because it shows where a structural shift became visible in ordinary lives. The steelworks closure revealed that the old BHP world could change even while the company remained powerful. It showed that institutional old money does not only produce wealth, reputation, and national confidence. It also produces dependence. Towns, workers, suppliers, and families can grow around a company's presence. When the company changes shape, the people closest to the old structure are often the ones asked to live with the gap between what the name once promised and what the future now requires. Newcastle gave that gap a human face. The next stage of BHP's story would move through corporate language: merger, demerger, portfolio, global resources, shareholder value, strategic focus. Those words can sound distant from a steelworks gate. Yet they belong to the same transformation. The cost had already been felt on the ground. The company's center of gravity was now shifting more visibly inside the structure of BHP itself. The merger that shifted the center of gravity. After Newcastle, the language of the story changed. At the steelworks gate, the transformation had been felt through workers, contractors, families, and a city trying to imagine life after a major industrial anchor. Inside the corporate structure, the same transformation began to appear through different words: merger, demerger, portfolio, scale, resources, focus, return. Those words sound colder than furnaces and pay packets. They also explain where BHP was heading. The old company had carried several identities at once. It was a mining company born from Broken Hill. It was a steel name tied to Newcastle and other industrial places. It was a shipping, collieries, and heavy industry force. It was a national symbol large enough to be called the Big Australian. For a long time, those identities sat together under one powerful name. By the early 2000s, that older arrangement was being pulled into a different shape. In 2001, BHP and Billiton completed a merger that created a much larger diversified resources group. On paper, it was a corporate transaction. In the deeper story, it marked a shift in the way BHP's future would be understood. The company's center of gravity moved further toward global resources, global assets, global investors, and global commodity demand. That does not mean the Australian origin disappeared. Broken Hill still mattered. The name still carried Australian memory. The company's history still began in New South Wales, and its identity still had deep Australian roots. Yet the future being built after the merger looked less like the older mining and steel institution that many Australians remembered, and more like a resources group competing across continents, commodities, and capital markets. Scale became the language of the new BHP. Not the scale of one steel city. Not the scale of one mining field. The scale of iron ore, copper, coal, petroleum interests at the time, and a wider portfolio of assets chosen for their place in global demand. The company was not trying to be sentimental about every part of its past. It was trying to position itself for the industries, commodities, and returns it believed would define its future. That is where the emotional gap widened. For workers in a steel town, BHP had meant presence. A gate. A shift. A furnace. A local wage. For the merged resources group, BHP increasingly meant global allocation of capital. Where should investment go? Which assets belonged inside the future company? Which operations fitted the strategy? Which parts of the old industrial identity still made sense inside a world of international scale? Those questions were not asked in the language of memory. They were asked in the language of corporate survival and growth.
The clearest symbol came soon after. In 2002, BHP Steel was demerged from BHP Billiton. Steel did not vanish from Australia, and it did not vanish from industrial life. It continued through a successor company pathway that would become associated with BlueScope. Still, the separation mattered. It signaled that steel no longer sat at the heart of BHP's future in the same way. That was a major change in meaning. For decades, steel had helped make the company feel national. It had connected mineral wealth to production, workers, towns, machinery, and the physical building of the country. When BHP Steel was separated, the company was not simply changing a line on an organizational chart. It was loosening one of the strongest links between the old big Australian image and the modern resources group taking shape. A company can keep its name while changing what the name points toward. That is what was happening here. BHP's old institutional power had come from the combination of ore, steel, infrastructure, capital, labor, and national trust. After the merger and demerger, the power did not disappear. It became more concentrated around resources and global scale. The company's future looked less like a broad Australian industrial system and more like a focused resources giant with Australian origins and international reach. For investors, that could look logical. For steel communities, it could feel like distance. For Australian memory, it created a harder story to tell.
The familiar public image had depended on a kind of balance: mining wealth connected to domestic industry, national production, and workers whose labor made the company's reputation visible. Once steel moved away from the center, the old image became harder to hold. BHP could still be powerful. It could still be Australian-born. It could still be central to the resource economy. Yet it no longer carried the same simple promise of mines feeding steelworks, steelworks feeding towns, and towns feeding national industrial confidence. The later pattern reinforced the direction. BHP would continue reshaping its portfolio, separating some assets, simplifying parts of its structure, and focusing more sharply on the commodities it saw as central to its future. South32's later demerger and the separation of petroleum interests belong to that wider pattern of refinement. The details can become complex quickly, and the documentary should not drown in them. The important point is simpler. BHP kept narrowing the distance between its corporate structure and its global resources identity. That made the company stronger in one sense. It also made the old name feel less familiar in another. The big Australian had sounded like a company rooted in the full machinery of national industry. The new BHP was still tied to Australia through origin, resources, headquarters, memory, and economic weight. Yet its future was increasingly framed through global demand, large-scale assets, commodity cycles, and strategic focus. That was not collapse. It was transformation. A collapse leaves ruins where the company once stood. This story left something more complicated: a surviving giant, a separated steel identity, workers and towns carrying memory, and a public name that no longer meant exactly what it had meant before. Newcastle had shown the cost on the ground. The merger and demerger showed the same shift inside the company structure. Together, they made the central question unavoidable. If BHP had not disappeared, then what had? What vanished was not the company. BHP did not disappear. That is the point that makes the story harder to tell honestly. There was no final corporate funeral, no simple ending where the name was removed from the economy and left only to archives. The company survived. It remained powerful. It moved deeper into the world of global resources, where scale, capital, commodity demand, and strategic focus mattered more than the older image of a broad Australian industrial institution. So the thing that vanished was not BHP itself. What weakened was the older meaning attached to the name. For decades, BHP had carried several identities at once. It was the Broken Hill Company, born from mineral wealth in western New South Wales. It was the steel name connected to Newcastle and the working rhythm of industrial cities. It was a company tied to shipping, collieries, ports, rail, furnaces, and the national confidence that Australia could turn its own resources into the material of industry. Those pieces had sat together under one public image: the big Australian. After Newcastle and the corporate restructuring that followed, that image became harder to hold. The company was still strong, yet steel no longer sat at the center of the future in the same way. The name still carried national weight, yet the old factory gate meaning was no longer as direct. The resource engine kept growing, while parts of the industrial world that had made BHP feel close to workers and towns were separated, closed, or moved into memory. That is the difference between collapse and transformation. A collapse suggests failure. BHP's story is not that. A collapse suggests a company broken beyond repair. BHP became one of the great resource powers of the modern world. Its trains kept moving. Its mines kept producing. Its boardrooms kept making decisions that mattered to markets, exports, and Australia's economic place in the world. Transformation is more complicated. It means something can survive by becoming less like the thing people remember. That is what happened to the old BHP image. The company name remained, the corporate power remained, the resource wealth remained. The old combination of mining, steel, towns, domestic industry, and public industrial identity became less central. The separation of BHP Steel from the group made that change visible in corporate form. Newcastle had already shown it in human form. For workers and towns, these distinctions could feel cold. A company may continue under the same name. A business may become more efficient, more focused, more global, and more valuable in the eyes of investors. None of that changes what a closed works means to people who built their lives around it. None of it changes what happens when a skill, a routine, a workplace, or a familiar industrial path narrows. That is why the old BHP story cannot be told only through corporate survival. It also has to be told through what became less visible. Steelmaking at Newcastle disappeared as a BHP operation. A city that had tied part of its identity to the works had to move through the uncertainty of losing that industrial anchor. Contractors, suppliers, apprentices, families, and local businesses had to adjust to a future where the company name still existed, while the local relationship to that name had changed. The company did not vanish from Australia. The closeness changed. That is the quiet loss at the centre of this chapter. BHP was still Australian-born, still tied to the country's resources, still part of national economic life. Yet the older sense of BHP as a broad industrial presence rooted in mines and steel towns no longer carried the same certainty. The public name survived, while some of the physical connections that had made it emotionally powerful became weaker. The old institutional power had shifted shape. Earlier, that power had been visible through ore, steel, machinery, labour, infrastructure, and public trust. It was power that could be heard in a mill and seen in a city skyline. After the transformation, more of that power sat in global portfolios, commodity flows, export markets, corporate strategy, and resource assets operating at a scale far beyond the old steel town imagination. That did not make the new BHP less important. It made it harder to recognize emotionally. A modern resources company can be enormous and still feel distant. It can shape the national economy while remaining invisible to people who do not live near its mines, ports, rail lines, or offices. The older BHP had also been large and corporate, yet steel gave it a kind of public physicality. It stood in places where people could point to a gate, a furnace, a shift, a skyline, and say, "That is where the company touches the city." When those places changed, the name changed with them. The old meaning did not vanish in one day. It thinned across decisions, restructures, closures, separations, and strategic choices. It moved from working sites into memory. It moved from daily routines into documentaries, local histories, plaques, and family stories. It moved from active industrial confidence into a more complicated form of remembrance. That is why language matters here. To say BHP collapsed would be false. To say nothing was lost would be just as incomplete. The company survived in a different form. The old industrial identity weakened. The steel connection became separated. Newcastle felt the human weight. Australia kept the resource power, the corporate name, and the economic influence. It lost some of the older belief that the same company could easily stand for mining, steel, workers, towns, and national industrial confidence all at once. That older belief had been powerful because it gave BHP a place in Australian memory beyond the share market. It made the company feel useful, physical, and national. It connected boardrooms to worksites, resources to wages, minerals to steel, and corporate scale to ordinary lives. When the company's centre of gravity moved elsewhere, that connection did not break everywhere at once. It became less direct, less simple, less visible. What remained was not a ruin. It was a contradiction. A surviving giant with an older self still attached to it in memory. A global resources company with a Broken Hill origin. A modern corporate power whose name still carries the echo of steelworks, mining towns, and workers who gave the old image its human weight. To see that clearly, the story has to leave the language of mergers and strategy for a moment and return to the physical places where memory still has shape: the mines, memorials, former worksites, and public markers that show what survived after the old meaning changed. The memorials, mines, and name that remain. Memory does not always look like a ruin. Sometimes it looks like a train still moving. Sometimes it looks like a company name still printed on reports, offices, mine sites, and ships. Sometimes it looks like a memorial standing quietly in a city that had to learn how to describe itself after steel. Sometimes it looks like a mining town where the ground still carries more history than any corporate timeline can hold. That is what remains of BHP's older story. Not one object, not one place, not one simple ending. A modern BHP still exists as a global resources company. Its present identity is built around materials the world continues to demand: iron ore, copper, metallurgical coal, and other resources tied to industry, energy, construction, and future infrastructure. The company survived the shift that changed its old industrial meaning. It did not become a museum piece. It became larger, more global, and more focused on resources. That survival matters. It also leaves the old question unresolved. The name that still operates today carries memories from places that no longer sit at the center of the company's future in the same way. Broken Hill still gives BHP its origin. Newcastle still gives the story its human weight. The Pilbara gives the modern image scale. Each place holds a different version of the same name. Broken Hill remains the beginning that cannot be separated from the company. The story started there with mineral promise, claim holding, discovery, risk, and the effort to turn or into corporate power. In the landscape around Broken Hill, mining history is not an abstract idea. It is visible in the ground, in the town's identity, in museums, in old records, and in memorials that remind visitors that mineral wealth was never created by the earth alone. The line of Lode Miners Memorial carries that meaning carefully. It honors miners lost in Broken Hill's mining history, and it should be spoken of with respect and precision. It is not a simple BHP monument, and the lives it remembers should not be folded carelessly into one company story. Its importance is broader. It reminds the viewer that every mining fortune, every industrial company, every resource empire rests on human labor, risk, and loss that can be easier to forget once the wealth has moved into balance sheets and global markets. That is part of Australian old money too. Not the polished version. The physical version. The version built from ground, danger, skill, machinery, and people whose work made distant wealth possible. Newcastle holds another part of the memory. There, BHP's steel story became part of a city's working identity. The steelworks closure did not erase Newcastle, and it should not be described as though it did. Cities adapt. People rebuild. New industries emerge. Communities are not frozen by one company's decision. Still, adaptation does not cancel memory. The Newcastle Steelworkers Memorial stands as a public reminder that the steelworks was more than a production site. It was a place where men and women worked across generations, where skills were learned, where wages moved through households and local businesses, and where the risks of industrial labor were carried by real people. The memorial matters because it gives worker memory a physical place. It says that the story is not only about corporate transformation, share prices, mergers, and strategy. It is also about those who made the old BHP visible. Former industrial land around Newcastle carries its own quieter message. Parts of the old steelworks landscape have gone through remediation and redevelopment processes. That kind of change can make memory harder to see. A site that once produced noise, heat, and movement can become leveled ground, new infrastructure, restricted land, or a place with a different use altogether. The physical shape changes. The old purpose becomes less obvious. Without archives, memorials, photographs, and local memory, the scale of what once happened there can fade from public view. That fading is not always dramatic. Often, it is practical. A sign comes down. A gate no longer opens for shift workers. A railway siding loses its old purpose. A building is removed, altered, or surrounded by new development. Younger people pass a site without knowing how many lives once moved through it. The company name remains famous, while the local geography of labor becomes harder to read. That is why the remains matter. They keep the story from becoming only corporate. They also keep it from becoming only nostalgic. BHP's modern resource power is real. The company still matters to Australia's economy. Its mines, railways, ports, exports, and corporate decisions continue to carry weight. The modern machine has its own workers, its own communities, its own risks, and its own national significance. The story is not that Australia moved from something real into something empty. The story is that the meaning changed. The old BHP was imagined through a broader industrial promise: minerals from Australian ground, steel made in Australian works, workers in Australian towns, and a company whose identity seemed to connect extraction with production. The modern BHP is more sharply defined by global resources. It remains powerful, yet the older factory gate connection is less central to how the name is understood. That leaves a complicated inheritance. Australia kept the company name. It kept the resource power. It kept the Broken Hill origin story. It kept BHP's place in business history. It kept the economic influence of a company that still helps shape exports, investment, and national debate. Australia also kept the memory of what changed: the steelworks gates, the workers who left, the towns that adjusted, the old assumption that a company so embedded in national industry would always mean the same thing. No single memorial can hold all of that. No mine entrance can explain it alone. No modern train through red dust can show the full chain from claim to corporation, from steel to strategy, from local work to global scale. Together, the places form a map of transformation. Broken Hill shows where the power began. Newcastle shows what that power meant to working lives. The Pilbara shows what the company became. The memorials show what should not be lost inside the language of survival. That is the final weight of the BHP story before the closing reflection. A company can survive and still leave behind an older self. A name can remain famous and still change meaning. A resource empire can keep moving while the people and places that gave it emotional force are left to carry the memory. BHP remains. The question is how Australia chooses to remember the world that made the name matter. BHP's final image is not a company disappearing. It is a name still moving through red country, while older places carry the memory of what that name once meant. Broken Hill gave BHP its beginning. Newcastle gave its steel story a human weight. Workers, miners, contractors, families, suppliers, and towns helped turn Auran Capital into something Australia recognised as industrial strength. The company survived, and its resource power survived with it. What changed was the older connection between mining, steel, local work, and national confidence. If your family worked for BHP, lived near the steelworks, knew Broken Hill, Newcastle, or another industrial town, share that memory below. Add corrections, local knowledge, or the next Australian company, mine, mill, bank, brewery, railway, or family fortune that deserves a serious documentary. The name remains, but the people behind it must not fade first.